Can we have the next, please? Freestanding models, okay. So Cuneo refers to these freestanding models as workshop models, or maquettes in French. We don't really know how they function, but they're very interesting. Let's take a look at a few. We already looked at this one, so you know this is just a model that basically was not found in the hands of a donor or inside a church. So it has more to do with the sort of the find site. It simply exists on its own, and of course now it is in a museum. Let's go to the next one. This is another model, also in Yerevan, now in the Museum of the City of Yerevan. And this, as you can see, is very different from the one we just looked at. It's much more perforated and has a different kind of form. Again, we have the gabled roofs, but here the drum and the dome are different. And you can see they have this more of a faceted kind of profile than what we saw before. Again, some damage has been incurred here. But this is another model for which we don't have any kind of a specific context. Cuneo, can I have the next slide? Cuneo believes that it could have been a model or a kind of a workshop model for this church, which is known as the Old Cathedral of Yerevan, or the Katolike of Yerevan, dated to the 13th century and later. But it's difficult to say. I mean, yes, there are certain similarities in terms of the structure of the roof, but precisely how it worked is not clear. Whether it worked as a kind of a workshop model that is some kind of a mock-up of the later churches is hard to say. We can't say that. Just because they look alike doesn't mean that's necessarily the case. Can we have the next slide, please? But there is very interesting evidence for the production of models in architectural practice that exists in Armenian sources. And this is, I think, very intriguing and really needs closer scholarly attention. So what I want to do is, before we get to the text, I want to sort of tell you the story of this model a little bit that only exists in this text. In 989, there was an earthquake, a very serious earthquake in Constantinople, which destroyed much of the city, but most particularly, it affected the dome of the Hagia Sophia, the great church of Constantinople. And the western portion of the dome collapsed, as did the great western arch, so closest to the doorway. Those things came down. And the accounts tell us that an Armenian architect, Cerdat, was brought in to make these repairs. So this text tells us, sort of gives us an account of how he did this. And I'm just going to sort of read it. And even Hagia Sophia, talking about the earthquake, the cathedral was torn to pieces from top to bottom. On account of this, many skillful workers among the Greeks tried repeatedly to reconstruct it. The architect and stonemason Cerdat of the Armenians also happened to be there, presented a plan, orinag is the word that's used, and with wise understanding prepared a model, kahapar, and began to undertake the initial construction, so that the church was rebuilt more handsomely than before. So this is fascinating, and what's interesting is that we have elsewhere in the Middle Ages, we don't have evidence for the use of models in building churches. What you have traditionally in the Middle Ages is church design taking place on site with ropes, that is, ropes drawn out to mark a plan, and then it went up from there. And master masons worked empirically. They weren't conceiving of models beforehand and then working out the actual building. That's something we associate much more with the Renaissance. So this is very, very interesting, and particularly that he's using both a plan and a model. Can I have the next slide? But the fact is that we actually can say what Cerdat did at the Hagia Sophia. There were archaeological studies of the dome undertaken by two scholars in the 70s, I think, and they actually were able to be precise about what he did. And what we know, here you're looking at a photograph of the dome, what we know is he was working in this area right here, we believe that he blocked up those two windows, those two pairs of windows on either side, here and here, and basically filled in. You see these lines, these ribs are actually radial ribs that project. He filled those in to strengthen the shell of the dome, and also, you see how this goes kind of flat right here? We believe he did that. That was part of his strengthening of the Western Arch. So we can actually be sort of precise about what he did at the Hagia Sophia. The next slide, please. Here's just another slide, again, of that western portion right here. The really difficult thing, though, is that the text, which is so interesting, suggests he used a model to make these changes. But when we look at our little models, when we look at our tiny churches, it's hard to imagine how they would have really helped him with this kind of intervention. When you think about the Hagia Sophia, 100-foot diameter dome, it's very hard to imagine how he could have worked that out using one of our little models. So it's hard to correlate the archaeological data with this interesting text. But Turdat is a very intriguing character. Can I have the next slide? For example, we know that he was commissioned and he built a church modeled after the 7th century church of Zvartnots. You see the 7th century church here. He was asked to build a replica, essentially, of this church. And you see it here. It's the church of Gagik in Ani, and it dates to 1001 to 6. So what's so interesting here, again, it's kind of a unique thing. We don't often have very, very precise replicas of churches in the Middle Ages. There's a whole discussion about medieval copies of churches. For example, a lot of copies were made of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. We have examples in England and France in the Middle Ages. But those copies really don't look much like the original. In the case of this, though, you can see they're almost exact. I mean, yes, you can see he's made some changes in terms of opening up the eastern apse, but basically it's the same. And not only is it the same in terms of proportion and shapes, but it's also almost exactly the same scale and size. It's unbelievable. So here we have to imagine that Turdat was using some very precise mechanism, some way of representing Zvartnots that got him to be able to create Gagik. So it's fascinating and sort of remains, a question, precisely how he did this. Can I have the next slide, please? There's another kind of wrinkle to the story of Turdat that takes us back to models, and that is the famous model of Gagik Bagratuni. Gagik Bagratuni was the king who asked Turdat to build this church for him, the Gagik church. And at this site, a model was found by Nikolai Mar. And you see the model here on the left. This is an old excavation photograph, which is all we have. And here you can see one of these wonderful old, photographs of the actual, rebuilding or the sort of setting up of this column at the site. Now, the model you can see. Can I have the next slide, please? The model you could see was a circular rotunda, circular church. Here you have basically what's left of Gagik now. So of course we can't really compare, the model with the church because the church no longer stands. But the model, can I have the next one? The model was used to help reconstruct what the church might have looked like.